Imagine that a politician is presenting a live music programme, and while they're on air they found out that some musician has passed away, and they announced that on air. Have they broken the law? Well, according to the High Court this week, probably not. But, so what am I talking about? Well, this is an interesting case involving GB News, the sort of rolling news channel, and Ofcom, the regulator of broadcast services. And how did this come about? Ofcom issued basically a sanction, two sanctions, against GB News for allowing Jacob Rees-Mogg to present a television programme. He had a little bit of a spot on there where he's doing like a regular, well, was it current affairs or was it a news? Because that's the issue. And I think you'll all like this one because it's got lots of Article 10, free speech, media, what is news, what is impartiality, what is bias, what is accurate reporting. And I'll link to the actual full judgment in the description because it's well worth a read and it covers a lot of ground. And it's a really excellent judgment in terms of setting things out. But Ofcom issue these two sanctions and say, oh, you shouldn't let Jacob Rees-Mogg present these programmes. But GB News brought what's called a judicial review and said, well, no, we haven't done anything wrong. We're allowed to do this. So first of all, how does Ofcom operate? Well, it was set up by the 2003 Communications Act. And that established Ofcom and said, your responsibility is to set rules for broadcasting and to enforce those rules. We get into lots of interesting things about our rules law. You know, it's a bit like the Highway Code. The Highway Code is not law, but breaches of the Highway Code can lead to sanctions. You know, you can be prosecuted for careless driving or inconsiderate driving or, you know, various motoring offences. And they'll say, well, the fact is you breached the Highway Code. So that's strong evidence that you also breached the law. And it's a very sort of similar operation. But under the regulations, and the thing is, these are all done in 2003, although they have been modified slightly over time. But at the time, there wasn't really sort of like, you know, rolling news and all these multiple opportunities to sort of, you know, see different channels. You know, it was set up at the time when it was basically, you know, Trevor McDonald sat there saying what was happening. I mean, I personally miss when they used to wear sort of bow ties and dinner jackets, even when they were on the radio. But hey, you know, we live in the modern era, I suppose. One of the rules they have is saying that any broadcaster of news, they have to abide by due impartiality and accuracy. So what's due impartiality? They said the key word there is due. It doesn't have to be completely impartial. I mean, say for instance, you know, you're doing a news story about a successful solo round-the-world yachting expedition. You can do that without getting on somebody who's a, you know, a flat earther to sort of put the other view and say they can't possibly have gone round the world or anything like that. But one of the rules looks at, you know, can politicians, you know, present TV programmes? And what they said is, well, politicians can present, you know, they've got Article 10 rights, they can present television programmes, especially on non-political things. So if they want to do a great railway journeys or a, you know, history documentary or something like that, that's perfectly fine. But they said what politicians cannot do is present news programmes, and that's quite a wide thing. It's either presenting it, doing interviews, I mean basically taking an active part in a news programme. But they said, well, what counts as a news programme? Because GB News's argument was, notwithstanding we're called, you know, a news channel, not all our programming is news. And this was in fact a current affairs programme. And therefore politicians can present them. And interestingly, the sanction was basically, you've got Jacob Rees-Mogg on here. We're not suggesting he wasn't telling the truth or even that he wasn't impartial. It's just the mere fact that you allow politicians to present news programmes is inherently partial, because it's politicised and they're obviously going to bring their own views and their own editorial slants to it. So, you know, obviously when you get news, you know, with the best will in the world, it can't be completely objective. People make editorial decisions as to what to say, how to present it, how much background detail. But in this particular case, they said, you know, we're not suggesting that there's anything wrong with the content. It's the mere fact that he presents this programme. And they got into the thing and say, well, according to your rules, this only applies to news programmes. And actually it's interesting because Ofcom came back and said, well, actually, yeah, I know it strictly says that, but we think it should be wider than that, and it should actually also include things like current affairs. And to cut to the chase, the court said, well, you know, you set your own rules. And the thing with judicial review is, you can review something if a state body, which Ofcom is, even though it's independent, it's established by the state, you can overturn decisions if they're what we call ultra vires, beyond the powers. You had no power to do this. They don't follow their own rules. So they say, well, here's all the rules, but they actually do something. Say, well, that's in breach of your own rules. They do things like just having a policy without looking at, you know, so we treat everything the same without looking at the individual circumstances. Or even if we're interpreting our own rules, we have done it in a way that is so perverse that no reasonable body could do this. And that's all grounds for overturning these decisions. Now, what they said is, they said, well, Jacob Rees-Mogg, he does a little news bulletin sometimes. He'll do a little recap of the news within his current affairs programme. And therefore, that converts a current affairs programme into a news bulletin, a news programme. And they said, well, yeah, but is it an absolute blanket ban? And like I say, they all came down to their own interpretation. Well, according to your own rules, it's got to be just, you know, they can't present a news programme. The mere fact there may be news within the programme doesn't necessarily make it a news programme. And one of the examples they looked at was the idea of, you know, because this is how sometimes you test these things. You go like, well, let's look at various hypothetical situations. I mean, courts don't often like looking at hypotheticals. They say, well, no, let's just deal with the facts as we have them. And, you know, if this situation ever arises in real life, we can look at it then. But sometimes you will say, well, look, let's look at various hypothetical situations and see what would happen. And one of the ones they said was, if a politician was presenting a programme they were perfectly entitled to, but, you know, like a music programme, but then, you know, they announced that somebody had died. Well, they are broadcasting news, aren't they? They're sort of going, oh, we are announcing that this has happened. So it's not like they're commenting after the fact and saying, well, you've probably heard that, you know, so-and-so has died. Here's a tribute to their career or something like that. And this is what the court said. They said, you know, this line is quite arbitrary. But in the end, they effectively said, we find that the ban on politicians presenting news programmes means specifically, you know, what most average people would understand as news. And they said, clearly this was a current affairs programme, not least because it had his title in it, is that Jacob Rees-Mogg presents whatever. And they said, by identifying it with a presenter, clearly your average audience, you know, they're pretty smart people, and people would understand that, okay, he's a politician, he's got various views, but he's doing a current affairs programme, but we'll take all that into account when assessing the programme. And they also said, we're not going to interfere with editorial judgments. As to how you actually present your news stories or your current affairs programmes, yes, so long as you sort of like, you know, tick the due impartiality box, you know, you're not too partisan one way or the other, we're not really going to interfere, and we're going to leave it up to editorial judgment pretty much to say whether it's impartial or not. So it might be, well, actually we think that was a bit partial, but we're not going to step on the editor's toes. So what's actually the result of this? Well, contrary to you think, oh, this is a massive victory for GB News and they've won, actually, what the court said was, look, the problems arisen here is because your rules as drafted, you know, if you want to make the argument you're making, you need to update the rules. They didn't say that, you know, there was an absolute right for politicians to present programmes. They just said at the moment they're not banned under the rules. And they said, yes, obviously the Article 10 things will come in. But, you know, Article 10 is a qualified right. You've got your right of free speech, but you can put rules in there to modify that so far as they are necessary and proportionate and reasonable in a democratic society. But what they've actually said is they've remitted these back to Ofcom and they've said, have another go. So they've overturned the sanctions at the moment. They've said, right, as far as we're concerned, they're a nullity, we've got rid of those. But they said, go back and reassess applying the rules as we've now sort of said. And like I said, we got into all this thing about, you know, how far are they rules? How far are they law? Because, you know, Ofcom has the power to fine and sanction people. So they're saying, you know, it is getting, you know, into law. It's beyond like the highway code. You know, a straight breach of the highway code. It's not like the traffic police can suddenly give you a fixed penalty notice just because you breached the highway code. They'd have to tie it to an offence. But what they've said here is Ofcom themselves can actually impose the penalties. But they've actually said that if you want to go away and rewrite your rules, that wouldn't be retrospective. You couldn't go back and say, well, we've rewritten the rule now to catch you because, you know, again, retrospective legislation, even though this isn't really legislation, it's all set up under legislation. You know, the statute, the Act of Parliament, the Communications Act 2003 says there will be a thing called Ofcom and they will set the rules for broadcasting and they will enforce any sanctions for any breaches of the rules. I said, you've got absolute power there, so go away. I mean, it may be you set rules and then somebody can challenge those and say they're a breach of Article 10. But what they actually said is, just go back, apply the rules as we have now explained them and rethink this decision. I mean, will they actually do that? Personally, probably not, because I think they had to more or less concede in the hearing that the rule they were trying to enforce, the way they'd actually written it and set it out, they'd used particular language, which they sort of said, with hindsight, we could have phrased that differently. And the court's gone, well, go and rephrase it. But I don't think that they would actually be able to fit this in because the court's made it very clear, and they've said the mere fact that you might touch upon news in an otherwise non-news broadcast doesn't actually make it a news broadcast. But what Ofcom's argument is, any mention of the news, regardless of anything, makes it into a news broadcast, even if it's part of, you know, an otherwise non-objectionable programme. But that's why the music presentation thing came up, because they said, well, if that's what you're saying the rules is, then that would be outlawed, and that doesn't really make a lot of sense to us. So my prediction is that this actually won't go any further, but it'll be interesting to see if Ofcom do tweak their rules a little bit and try to enforce this. Right, for the sake of impartiality, no politician could present any programme that even vaguely hints or touches on the news. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. But like I say, I'll link to the full judgment because it's a fascinating read. It can get a bit technical, and also, you know, it goes into very precise interpretations of a few words and a few phrases. But I'd be very interested in your comments on this one, because I know there's a lot of sort of free speechy interested people out there. You know, should it be free for all? Should politicians just be allowed to present news and say what they want, or is that effectively free party political broadcasting? Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, hope you found that vaguely interesting, vaguely useful, vaguely accurate. Where I'm at today, I'm at a place called St Clement by the river, although the river's disappeared because I've realised I've come at low tide. So I hope you all like mud flats. There's a couple of birdies out there. I can never tell if they're herons or egrets or avocets. But they're sort of basically just birds who just like walking around in the mud. Speaking of mud, I washed my truck before I came here, and then I'll get my truck all nice and clean, and then drive down the world's muddiest track to come here. Good thinking, Al.